These people were avid hunters and fishers. They were experts at understanding the makeup of their local environment. They weren't following big game anymore. They were concentrating here, seasonally at least, on exploiting really rich food resources. When we talk about mining copper, we're really talking about quarrying rather than digging deep, big holes in bedrock. This is a quarry over by Mass City. Bruce Rucola, who's in the back, knows this area like the back of his hand. But really, if you're talking about taking copper out of the living rock, it's more like quarrying flint or other useful materials to make weapons, which people have been doing literally for millions of years by the time they discovered copper in our region. Here we have some of the materials of the hammers that actually extracted the rock from the living, or extracted the metal from the living rock. Were composed of. We have a basalt hammer, a quartzite hammer here on the left, which is really beautiful in addition to being effective, and then a gabbro hammer over here. Each of these hammers might have had a different lifespan in terms of use. This one on the lower side, you can see, is already bashed up and pretty much exhausted. The objects themselves from the Archaic period are decorative, they're functional. The one on the bottom is a long-lived form. It's some people call that a woman's knife or an ulu. It's very similar to ones further north from here on the up on the in the boreal forest. There they would appear in copper, also in slates and other materials. The one on the top is probably a nose ornament. One of the things that's really the most interesting to me is the fact that people had to have really deep knowledge of the physics and transfer of leverage from material to material as they use these copper tools, because the tools that we find archaeologically look like these big, heavy woodworking tools, but the fact of their use in life was as hafted tools in which transfer the direction of force would happen routinely. So a tool would have to have a cutting edge like you see right here. It would have to have a handle like you see hypothetically there and there. And then there would have to be a mastic that actually kept the two parts together and would allow the two materials to deliver a force. There must have been enormous failure rates in that function, but I've always been impressed by how adept at understanding the physical properties of materials they must have been to be able to figure out how to hack the tools and keep them from falling apart during use. Here at the bottom of the row of tools here, these are moving up out of the Archaic period. They're I don't know exactly how old they are, but they're probably in the range of 3,000 to maybe 2,500 years ago. And each one of them probably had a different kind of technology to allow the fastening of the handle to the tool. All the places where that fastening would happen are on the bottom of the tool. So you can see from their different forms that there are lots of different demands for understanding how to use materials to make a tool effective. Now here's sort of a mythical rendition of what a seasonal fishing village may have looked like. You could transfer this to, Bay of Bree maybe, or Great Sand Bay, or I don't know, one of my favorite places, Eagle Harbor. A cluster of loosely related groups of people living in seasonal houses, focusing on fishing, and largely socially, these groups are probably relatively independent of one another. They may have been extended families of 3 or 4 lodges clustered together, maybe some relatives living together, but they didn't bother with centralized political authority. That's probably why they were happy people. They were autonomous by our standards in terms of movement. They would move places when they felt like it. There was no central person saying, you have to stay here this week and you can't go till next month or anything like that. If some woman had a dream and she thought, I don't like this place anymore, I don't like my dream, that would be motivation to leave. And you can see maybe the practical applications of that. If a person were feeling unhappy, maybe it's the people over in that hut over there who are making her feel uncomfortable and she wants to get out of there as soon as possible. Or maybe there's something about the environment that's not suitable. This autonomy gave them great flexibility, which they needed, obviously, to face a challenging environment like the one we live They were adept understanders of the habits of fish. They probably exploited 25 or 30 species of fish. Many archaeological sites, if you run through all the fauna that are of the animals, bones that are found there, there'll be 20, 25 species of fish that are exploited. They had a technology for each kind of fish. They knew the fish's habits. They knew where the fish were going to be seasonally. They knew what the fish liked and didn't like. This is a depiction in the 19th century of flambeau fishing or torchlight fishing for walleye. They also had an adept technology for taking different kinds of fish to be strategic in terms of depth. So they would set a net at a certain depth. They would make the net a certain size in terms of the mesh, and that arrangement would select for a particular kind of fish. They knew that some fish didn't like to take a hook or an angle, like whitefish don't. Those were more likely to be netted. So they had these technologies for place, for species, for season, to be strategic about capture. They also built corrals in the water, and there's a great description in Schoolcraft back in 1820 of going up the Ontonagon River about 4 miles and coming across a huge weir or fence or trap that was designed to keep sturgeon. And swimming in and out, the sturgeon come into the weir, they can't get out. They're in a nice little, if you will, fishbowl for people to go right out and take them at their leisure to use for food. So they had lots of different designs of fish technology. So we have pottery moving into the area from the north, from probably Minnesota, in 2,500 years or so ago. Pottery was probably invented in lots of different places in the Western Hemisphere and certainly in North America. We don't find whole pots, beautiful whole pots in this region because of the freeze-thaw cycles that just blow them apart. They're not heavily fired, they're not real tough, they're not painted, and so they don't have much protection from just being exfoliated by freeze-thaw. So we find little hunks of them rather than big, beautiful pots. There are lots of different kinds of pots in this region, and that's because Lake Superior had I'm going to say migrant population, but that's going to imply the wrong thing. It had a transient population of habitual users, and these habitual users came from lots of different places. And we can see those places echoed in the styles of pottery that we find in this region. This one is a broken one. This is one called Laurel pottery. It has a long life. This is the first pottery that we see in our region. It's relatively tough, and it's related to the earliest pottery that's in Minnesota. Oops. We also have other materials that are being used at this time. All kinds of botanical materials, not only for tea or for medicine or for food, but also for technological needs. This is a woven piece that's got 3 or 4 components. It's got quill from porcupines. It's got probably dogbane. They have some, let's see, I think there's some hemlock in it. I think there's also some milkweed fibers, lots of different fibers, which are stripped, retted, twisted, and then woven into various materials. Also decorative things. This is one of the most long-lived artifact forms in the entire North American world. The bead. These are copper beads. If you look carefully, you can see a strand of the original string. That is not something that I put there. That's something that somebody did in about 300 AD, the original string that came from the copper beads. We also have this. This is the I like to say, call this the Swiss Army knife of the prehistory. It's a much used piercing tool that can be used to carve, it can be used to pierce, and it can also be used to turn itself into other tools. If somebody wants to hammer out a fish hook, for example, these awls would be the source. When we talk about other food, we've got some wonderful food resources in this region. One important one, a very highly storable, dryable food, wild rice, which was far more widespread in our region before lots of logging and lots of industrial adaptations happened here. We have this wonderful fish. This is lake trout. The second name, its specific name is actually an Ojibwa word, or an Anishinaabe word. A wonderful, plentifully available, protein-rich food, unfortunately susceptible to overfishing, so people have to be very careful about that. Because these are homing fish and they like their own spawning habitat to reach. The third great food is maple sugar, a incredible technology that impressed Europeans when they came to North America to, well, I think first to taste it and then to figure out how it was made. And this is an historic depiction. You can see that there are trade kettles hanging over the fire, but believe me, we have lots of evidence from prehistory that this is a practice that was done with stone boiling in pre-European contact times. Okay, I was talking about pottery and how you can track its appearances across the basin and from other places. This one on the left is black duck pottery from Minnesota. It looks sort of like that laurel stuff that you saw earlier, and that's because it's the next kind of pottery that comes in. And lasts, basically, this one lasts almost up to the period. This one on the right is from Illinois and Wisconsin. It's a kind called Ramian sized. It's very, very tough compared to the local stuff. It's a little bit older than this one on the left, but it is more typical of the areas of Illinois and Wisconsin than it is of our region. So we think people were trading ideas, they were trading materials, they were trading women perhaps, who we think were the potters, back and forth. This one is probably the most exotic one that we're going to find here. This one is from Huronia over in Simcoe County, Ontario, near Toronto. This is associated with Huron people, and it's so distinctive that when we see things that look like this or are like this here, we know that the Huron made them or traded them. There are multi-ethnic Huron, Ojibwa, Ottawa villages over in the eastern part of the UP where the Huron took refuge after they were thrown out of their homeland by the Iroquois in 1649. Okay, so at European settlement, we have lots of different kinds of pottery. The Huron pottery over in the east, the Jutland pottery, which is near Lake Michigan. Different kinds of pottery over in the west. And as you come closer and closer to the time in which Europeans came to this region, we can more and more link particular potteries with particular ethnic groups. So that's, the Huron is a good example of that. As soon as European materials came in, local people here acquired them and transformed them into ways and shapes that were familiar from their own experience. And so, for one thing, that they took glass from glass beads and they melted it down and cast it into shapes, pendant shapes that they were more familiar with. They decorated their clothing with stroud and ribbon. They were very happy to have woven cloth in some cases. So these materials, interestingly, are not necessarily superior, they're just novel. Who wouldn't want something novel? And the first thing that people did was sort of adapt it to their own understandings of an aesthetic and of how things should look. These are 19th century weavings. These are basswood. I just wanted to put this in to show you that continuing through the centuries of European contact, the basic ideological perspectives and beliefs about how the universe functioned were still very much intact and are intact in native operations. This one has this is the Masters of the Universe duel going on with the Mitsubishi Manitou, the Bad Water Panther on the top panel. On the other side, the Thunderbird. These two mythical characters are in constant battle for the control of the universe. Nobody ever wins. It's just perpetual struggle to see whether the Thunderbird or the underwater panther will rule the day. And this is probably a medicine bag of some kind. Weaving of bulrush mats and other kinds of things is a skill that was long-lived, still is. This is a late 19th, early 20th century photo of a woman who's doing some weaving with rushes. And this one is this is a summer house. This photo was taken in Gogebic County, late 19th, early 20th century. Even in the 1930s, people would say, Gee, I wish we had one of those summer houses. It was so much cooler, there were fewer insects. I like it better than the frame house I have to live in now. Very popular alternative to living in a frame house. I put these up just to show you two things. One is the long-lived and persistence of the material culture of what we think of as the past, but which is very, very lively in our region. And the second thing is to show you how subject to degradation these objects are. You know, we see copper as, you know, really a wonderful material, and we see lithics as wonderful materials. But it's the stuff that's not preserved, that's organic, that disappears, that we have such a rare opportunity to see. Things like weavings and houses and those kinds of things.
Is that birch bark?
Yes, it's birch bark. Okay, so I know I've gone fast, but second act is sitting here on the floor over here. And so I want to introduce Seth DePasqual of the National Park Service. He's the Cultural Heritage and Resources person at Isle Royale National Park, and he's going to talk a little bit about his research on Isle Royale. And if you'll hold any questions, we'll do a little tag team after his presentation. Thank you.
I think we're all cold when we came here, so that's probably changed. So let's go to the beach. Thanks everyone for coming. Susan said I'm Seth. I work for Isle Royale National Park. I've been there since 2009. And I'm going to be talking today about some of the research that I've been doing over the past couple of years, something that initiated in 2012. Related to some of the relic shorelines around the island, and specifically the archaic cultures that we know less about on the island. And we're going to be talking about beaches, old beaches, relic beaches, and here's a few images that are kind of rare within my presentation, at least photo-wise, of the beach environment. The individual on the left is essentially standing at the top end of a relic shoreline as it proceeds further down to the right. And the image on the right is a few individuals standing at the top of a beach line, and the photo was taken from the base. And so we're essentially staring at terraces that are out in the woods, and the beach, of course, is on top, and this is essentially a beachhead. And I'll get into that soon enough. I imagine most of you are quite familiar with Isle Royale, how it sits in context with the rest of the Superior shoreline. We know that Native American groups have been coming out there for at least 4,500 years. We suspect much earlier, coming from the North Shore predominantly and perhaps only. There are no signatures in the material assemblage that suggest folks coming up from the southern shore, such as Keweenaw. I do see an individual in the room today who actually kayaks across this stretch of water, and it's a very risky proposition in even doing so from the North Shore. It's a 13-mile stretch at the closest point. It's not something you do on the fly. It's taken very seriously, of course, today, but even back in the day, it wasn't something that you just did. You thought about it and you waited for your day, and perhaps you had more time on your hand, but a very risky proposition. And so people coming to the island for a lot of the same reasons that we do today, to get away from the warmer climes on the mainland, to come and to fish, of course. It's a renowned fishery as it is today, and fishing is probably the most predominant theme through all of the island's history. People fish today just like they did 5,000 years ago. And also, just to get away, like I said, from the warmer climes, but also, as we all know, to exploit the copper resources there. The folks on the mainland saw the island as a resource. It was a source of copper. It was a place to go in the summertime. And they were essentially merchants of copper. And so that meant a lot to those people. And I'm sure they guarded in a certain way. That was a resource that they were able to kind of trade and spread around to other communities, you know, through their systems of trade. And it was a very important resource to them, such as it was for the native groups that would come up from the south and spend time around the southern shorelines. And it's not a super complex situation of finding the copper. It's a matter of canoeing around the island, getting to know your environment, and understanding that a simple vein of calcite might actually offer you a copper specimen that you could extract with hammerstones. And spending a lot of time in canoes going around the island, more so after deglaciation. There was quite a bit more of the island that was exposed in different places, and before you know it, they were happening upon these different locations. This particular image I'm going to delve into my research is a digital rendering of the island's topography. And in a nutshell, an airplane flies over the island, bounces light waves off of the island's topography, receives a big giant data cloud, and assembles it in a mosaic, which produces an image like this. And when I came into the park, working for Royale in 2009, I fell into this sort of thing, and it just literally was in my lap, and I thought, that's pretty interesting. And I spent some time, I went to school at Michigan Tech, thinking about the historic mines. And if you really kind of zoom in on this image, you can start teasing out those historic mining landscapes, and Keweenaw Mine and Siskiwit Mine and some of the mining landscapes that you're familiar with really pop out at you on this imagery. However, and I thought, okay, that's great. I kind of figured that would be possible. But what else can I do with this? And so I started thinking about the prehistoric story. And I can't see prehistoric mining pits with this rendering. It's the size of the pits are too small to really pop out at you. But then I started playing around with the shorelines. And we'll get back to the image in a little bit, but here is Isle of Royale, the prehistory as we know it. From all the archaeological expeditions that have been performed here since like the late 1800s, and beginning maybe in the 1840s, or we know in the 1840s. And through archaeological investigation, we're able to kind of put together a number of different, this is our understanding of the island as we know prehistory today. This is by no means a comprehensive list of every known site on the island, or excuse me, every site on the island. We suspect much more is out there. And you might already notice that there's a big void off here in the southwest side of the island. And that's not because there's no sites out there, that's because archaeological examination has been fairly limited. Much of the work that we do on the island is around today's modern shorelines, and we discover a lot of woodland sites. It's a more recent shoreline, and it's tied in with some of our compliance work that we do. You got to go check a campground, and so you find an archaeological setting. But rarely are archaeologists spending much time in the interior. So here's the present shoreline without all of those archaeological sites presented for you. But if you go back quite a ways, 10,000 years ago, there was a glacier on top of this rock, and that glacier receded. And as that glacier receded, the island, after all of that pressure had been reduced, has been lifting, or essentially rising out of the lake. Now, of course, there's some fluctuations in the lake levels, and it's a very complex story with beachline transgressions and regressions. But for our purposes here, the island is rising. And if you can imagine 10,000 years ago, the island looked a certain way. 5,000 years ago, as the island's rising, beaches are going up higher and now kind of moving in the interior, if you will. Here's that island 5,000 years ago. And for folks familiar with the island, McCargo Cove on the north shore, the gateway to Isle Royale for millennia, pretty much runs right into Chicken Bone Lake. If I had a laser pointer, I'd point it, but I don't stand up. Chippewa Harbor, down here on the south shore, essentially the reflection, the mirror opposite of McCargo Cove, it's all a fault line, if you will, connects to Lake Ritchie. And so this is probably the quickest, well, is the quickest way to get from one side of the island without having to subject yourself to nasty seas up at the tip there at Blake's Point. Now, if we overlay this same image with the archaeological sites as we know them today, quick observation. Most of them, the sites that we know today, are woodland or were underwater 5,000 years ago. They weren't sites then because they weren't accessible. And I've highlighted the yellow sites as the archaic, and you'll know that there's relatively few. And that's what I was interested in. Why are there so little archaic sites here? We know so much more about the woodland. Same rule applies, just limited archaeological survey. So to delve into the work that people have done in the past along the archaic, I look at the research done by MTU in the 1950s by Roy Dreyer, who with Griffin was able to do some radiocarbon sampling up at the Menong mine. and carbon dated, the oldest known carbon site on the island, carbon date on the island, which is 4,500 years before present. Carbon sample taken from the bottom of a mining pit. Not necessarily directly correlated to the very activity of that mining. It could have been a tree that burned down hundreds of years later and rolled into that pit, but it gets us pretty close. So he provides a baseline of the earliest known dates that, at least that we're aware of. And then in the 1960s, we actually have our first large-scale baseline survey of the island entire, performed by Tyler Bastian, located a handful of archaic period sites, who, by the way, was particularly interested in the shorelines, as I am today. Wanted to spend more time on it, but was diverted to a number of the woodland settings, and it was just a bear of a project for him. Did some interesting research up on the Menam. And then in the late 80s and early 90s, work undertaken by Michigan Tech, Pat and Susan Martin, along with the Midwest Archaeological Center. And found more archaic sites, put out a few publications that really called attention to the island's archaic. And what did we learn from that research? Does anybody know Bill DePasqual?
Yeah.
Recognize that guy on the right? Bill DePasqual was there in the 62. So from all of this research, Clarkson summarized everything. Sites, archaic of course, locations chosen with proximity to water, makes sense. On or near sheltered embayments as a primary concern. Flint napping was by far the most dominant activity at archaic sites, and we're referring to archaeological investigations, excavations that provide us this information. Emphasis on tool production using locally available Portage Lake rhyolite, previously known as Portage Lake quartzite, as a material of preference or necessity. And composition of subsistence remains do not appear to have changed greatly between the archaic and woodland cultures. Big sample size for the woodland, less so for archaic. So they're drawing upon interesting information. It's less than what they had to refer to for the woodland period. Copper. Wort copper is quite deteriorated and not so much waste copper. So they're not seeing various stages of tool production. They're just seeing a few formal tools, but not many. And it's really crude, it's really deteriorated. Formal tools are rare at archaic sites. No evidence to support association with old copper complex, which is an Upper Peninsula and Wisconsin-based archaic period culture. More likely was Shield Archaic, which is relates to the cultures found up on the North Shore, originating from the Thunder Bay area. So that's my baseline. That's where I'm going to start. So you look at the previous work that's done before you. I've extracted all of the woodland period sites. Here's our archaic as we know it today on the island, or excuse me, in 2012 when I started my research. And I also overlaid our trail network system, and you might quickly be able to correlate the finds along our trail system. So that tells you that some of the research, not necessarily the research, but some of our findings are biased to convenient trail resources. Makes sense. You're happening along the trail and you find this sort of thing, and these trails, of course, tie to campgrounds, and you know that makes sense that they're finding this sort of thing. But clearly we need to start looking elsewhere and get away from the convenience. And so that's what we did. And I've highlighted this area on the southwest side to talk about the work that we've been doing lately. So here's a zoomed image of Cumberland Point on the southwest side of the island, and I've delineated the different shorelines according to date. Everything in beige is essentially the more recent shoreline all the way up to the Nipissing. And where the beige hits the pink, that's the Nipissing beach line. And you can see that it's fairly pronounced. You know, the features like this. I mean, this is the Nipissing right here, really obvious, and more so in certain places than others. And as you migrate from the pink up into the dark red, you can start really seeing those old shorelines associated with the Menam period getting closer to 10,000 years ago following deglaciation. What I'm really interested in is we have a copper object located South Fowl Lake, socketed spear point, had a little piece of wood in it, carbon dated to 7,000 years old, really nice spear point. That's in Minnesota. And where did that come from? Could it have come from the island? And if so, we've got a really big gap of information there. And And so that's pushing me into the field to look more, to see if we could maybe perhaps push the dates back a little bit. And around the time that I'm starting to play around with this data, there's an individual, Andrew Breckenridge, a professor down at University of Wisconsin Superior, who has been interested in the shoreline data. I don't know if you know, all of Minnesota has been LiDAR. There's LiDAR data for the entire state, where I used to think this was really cool. They got the whole state. And so he's been comparing the two locations, the island against the mainland shore. He's been calibrating the specific beaches on the island. He said, hey, are you interested in this data? I said, oh, God, yes. So this, of course, goes on my GPS unit. I go out in the field, and I can really feel good about where I am in the woods and what particular beach line I am. So that's one of the tools I use. The hide scraper that I just mentioned earlier was located, as well as some other lithic fragments. But right at the end of the survey, we located a copper chisel at the Keweenaw Peninsula site. Conveniently by the other crew, after we split up and they went around the corner and I punched in many, many holes, and then I get a call on the radio, I've got a copper chisel. Good for you. Which is great, exciting news, because we were just excited. So that prompted an excavation in 2013. We teamed up with St. Cloud University, specifically a student, Megan Stroh, who was fishing for a research topic and just said, this is yours. And she came out there in collaboration with Grand Portage National Monument, associated with the fur trade era, but also celebrating its native history and its native associated with the portage there. The primary users of Isle Royale in more recent times. And so the superintendent there, Tim Cochran, absolutely supports research on Isle Royale and collaboration between the respective groups and Superior National Forest. Lent a few individuals. And from this excavation, here is the Portage Lake Rhyolite, which we associate with archaic sites. Abundant, whereas more materials such as jasper taconite. Who's calling? An exotic material from the mainland. All right. And Portage Lake Rhyolite, which is interesting and worth noting, is actually a local resource where all of the other materials that come from the island, or excuse me, that are found on the island, archaeological settings, comes from the mainland up in the Thunder Bay area, various lithic sources. So when you see a lot of this in the archaic period of the Portage Lake Rhyolite, and much less of the exotic materials from the North Shore. Really nice copper specimens, formal tools such as this knife here, some preforms such as this point here with the tang, could have been a knife. Another knife up here on the right, a long, thin awl used for perforating a number of things. Waste copper, not previously identified in some archaic period sites. And some investigations ongoing, apparently probably a hearth feature. And this, of course, was located on the last full day in the field in the torrential downpour. Really horrible survey conditions, but we're there, we go out, you just deal with it, and then you punch into a site. And literally, and this happens so rarely, is when you move from one polygon to the next, and you're trying a whole new area, and you throw in that first shovel, literally the first shovel, boom, get into a site. 10 meters away, I drop a second shovel test pit. Same thing. In every subsequent pit, we found something. So really extensive site. Here's Portage Lake Cobble. It's in cobble form, this local resource. Bits and pieces of it, a feature on the bottom right I'll highlight here. PLR biface, the first formal tool identified native to this material. Really significant find this past year, posted recently on a Facebook page. Not mine. Isle Royale's Facebook page, go see it if you want to learn the story there. Fossil remains. Socketed preform here, formal tools. This year we did some metal detector work to help sort of delineate boundaries in some of the sites that we were finding. What we did notice is that there's a lot of float copper out there that's not necessarily cultural, and we'd find it just kind of out in the middle of nowhere, and nothing else we'd find, and none of the shovel tests would reveal anything else. And that's interesting to know, that there seems to be just abundant copper, bedded of course, but also floating around the island, if you will. And then back to my observations, or the observations made by Captain Clark. We're learning that site locations are still made in close proximity to water. Flit napping by far the most dominant activity at the sites. We're finding copper, but much more of what we find is that lithic material. Emphasis on tool production, such as the Portage Lake rhyolite. All of this is supported in what we're finding. And then, granted, it's a small sample size, but we're still seeing faunal remains that are similar to what we've seen previous. There were some fish bones. However, with regard to copper, it's not supported what we were noticing before, that it's quite deteriorated. We're finding really beautiful knives and preforms, lots of waste copper, lots of copper with matrix in it. So we're seeing every stage of tool production associated with copper use. Formal tools absolutely there, and no evidence to support association with old copper complex. No, but we are starting to notice more formal tools, but nothing such as those ornate objects, the ulus and the nose piercings or the copper beads. So in summary, recent findings suggest that the Nipissing phase of the island was quite active on the west side, particularly in the Washington Harbor area. But despite these findings, early use of the island remains enigmatic, and much more study is necessary. Limited sampling, we're starting to build on that now, learning more as we go, but there's a whole shoreline to do. Not that we'll ever do the entire thing, but there's just more work to be done. And for next summer, we're going to give focus to the eastern side of the island with 2 predictive models that I have 2 separate students working on. One's an undergrad, another one is a graduate student. And hopefully test excavations at one of the sites we located last summer. So more to do, more to see. Volunteers are always appreciated. It's a really fun survey and really excited about the project. And with that, thanks for coming, everyone.